We are going to continue now with the Bible 101, which we were doing. This will be Bible 101-8, and it will go in the seminary folder. Now, where we left off, we were talking about the idea of covenant. Of course, covenant is very important. The original covenant with Abraham is the original covenant, which begins with the history of the Hebrew people in Genesis. Now, as we continue with this, what we're going to find in covenant, and we will get to it, but I want to explain this first. There are basically two types of covenant. One is a conditional covenant, and one is a not conditional covenant or unconditional covenant. So those are very important differences, and we will get to them. But first, we're going to talk about what's a conditional covenant and where you'll find it. For example, the laws given on Mount Sinai through Moses to the people is in the form of a covenant. This is known also as the Ten Commandments. The covenant equals mutual agreement between God and his people. Scholars see a basis for this in the Near East covenant, treaties between leaders and vassals. This Mosaic covenant is a conditional covenant. It says, I, your God, will protect and guide you and teach you as you agree to keep my commandments and fulfill my calling. This is the key to the rest of the historical books. They show how the Jewish people struggle with the covenant, how they enshrine this law in the Ark of the Covenant to take with them throughout their entire wanderings through the desert, how they become a symbol of their identity and meaning, how they sometimes succeed and sometimes fail to live up to this covenant, and the lessons this teaches about responsibility to their conditions. Then they become a nation. This translates into their visibility equaling light to those nations around them. That's what they're supposed to do. They demonstrate a form of government and life that is ethical, just, economically fair, and a living example of how people should live together in a society. This tribal wanderings to establish their nationhood, the covenant is the guiding thread to the rest of their beliefs as a light, being a light to the nations. Now, another lesson is failure. When conditions fail and they become mixed with the non-ethical of the nations around them, then the evil of social life, structural evil, evil interconnected and institutionalized, find consequences in the breaking of the type of covenant and the consequences of exile, loss of identity, loss of calling, loss of meaning, loss of land, and loss of nationhood. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land, as quoted from the Bible? Here we see the role of the prophets. They are conscience and see how evils and points to the forgotten covenant and foretells exile. They warn kings and leaders and government, injustice, economic imbalance, poverty, military crimes, idolatry, loss of ethics, immorality, forgetting the meaning. All these are and more lead to disaster. In the midst of this, at the high point of their national life, before exile, at the time of David, just before Solomon, there is another covenant. Now you hear in here all about this first covenant, that it's conditional. And when it's followed, you see what happens to the nation. They are following their own destiny to become a light, not only to themselves, but to the other nations. But when they fail and do not keep the covenant, you see that's the other side of the coin. They do not have what they should have. They not become who they should become. In fact, they end up in quite a bit of disaster. Now, we are going to go only a little further here because we don't want to overdo the time, but we want to say here is another covenant. Now, this covenant is a Davidic covenant, and it is not a conditional covenant. That means it promises a lineage of the kingship of the line of David, which is eternal and everlasting, connecting God with his people. Now we have two covenants, one conditional, which you just heard, and one unconditional. So when we go on, we're going to go to the unconditional, which is called the Davidic covenant. So we will continue next with the unconditional Davidic covenant.